Many of you know that David Dykes, who grew up in South Alabama, where he came to know the Lord as a child and began preaching when he was 17, has a gift for connecting us to our faith base. He's pastored churches in Alabama, where he became before he became pastor here in 1991. The membership here is over 16,000 members. It's recognized as one of the leading churches in America in terms of mission and evangelism. Today, he's going to join us in a different capacity. He is joining us as a dad who, with his daughter, Laura Grace, will share their family story. Laura Grace is a stay-at-home mom who has successfully fought depression for 18 years. She continues to work on her health daily, as well as encourage others through her writing to keep fighting for the mental health we all deserve. I had the opportunity to get Laura Grace's book last year. I read the book. I've shared it with some other people. Thank you, Laura Grace. And I think hearing their family story is going to be something that will speak to all of us. So we would ask you at this time to please transition forward, and may God just bless your words as you share them.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Phil Burks. It's going to be my joy to interview David and Laura Grace this morning. We thought we'd take a little different approach on it today to tell you the story behind the story, if we can, or for them to do this. Many of you have read Laura Grace's book and the article that was in the Tyler paper as well, which kind of introed this. And so we have several questions we're going to go through, and we'll be done here at about 9:30, something like that. So thank you guys for being here. I know this is kind of a different way of doing this with you guys, and I appreciate you very much for doing this. David, I want to start with you this morning. And I know as a parent, there is a point where you say there is something going on. Can you kind of share when you first learned of Laura Grace's deep depression?
Well, sure. You know, I'm like a lot of guys in that I'm clueless most of the time about everything that's going on. And so it was actually Valentine's Day of 2001. My wife and I love to visit art galleries, and we had planned sort of a little getaway trip on Valentine's Day to go to Fort Worth to go to the Kimball Art Museum and spend a couple of days there. So the car was packed. We had clothes. Everything was taken care of. And it was perfect timing, because just moments before we were about to go walk out the door to get in the car, the phone rings, and it's Laura Grace calling from Baylor. And my wife is answering the phone, and she says, "What's wrong?" And about all Laura Grace can say is, "I'm wrong." And we just knew that we needed to go see her, be with her immediately. So we made the trip from Tyler to Waco, probably breaking a few of the man's speed limits to get there. And then when we got to the dorm there, we found that Laura Grace had attempted suicide. She had attempted an overdose of over-the-counter medication, and she was a really sick girl at that time. And so that's kind of, it just hit us in the face that sudden that something is wrong with our precious daughter. You know, as I look back on it, I see God's hand in it in many ways, because at that time, Dr. Alan Paul was my personal physician, and I had his personal cell number. And we didn't know at that time, because we're still at the dorm. We're not sure, does she need to go to the emergency room? Does she need to go to a hospital? Is what she ingested, is it harmful? And I call Alan Paul's cell number, and it's like, I don't know, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. How many physicians are going to answer their cell phone first ring in the middle of the afternoon? And it's Dr. Paul. And I just described to him what Laura Grace had done. And he immediately knew what to do. He said, immediately you need to go to the ER here at the hospital in Waco. He said, I'm going to call ahead and tell them what's happened, and they're going to be there waiting for you. So that was a pretty momentous day for us to drive there and find out that our little girl, my youngest daughter, was really sick. And I hadn't really picked up on any of the symptoms of that before. So that's how we first discovered it. It just kind of hit us in the face, as truth usually does sometimes.
So, Lord Grace, Mom and Dad are rushing to see you. Help us understand what was going on in your life at that time that got us to this point.
Well, I think that the depression had been building in my life for at least a year at that point, and I had really kept it hidden. Being a pastor's daughter, growing up being very extroverted and gregarious, I felt that I had to hide these negative feelings that I had going on, and I did that as long as I could. But in the last probably few months beforehand, I just got quieter and quieter. I stopped emailing and calling, and privately in my own life, I stopped going to class, I stopped eating, I stopped showering, I stopped sleeping, I stopped doing everything. And it was just a lot of pressure from college. I was rushing for a sorority at the time. There was just a lot going on, and I was trying to fit in, but I had this huge burden of at least a year's worth of depression on me, that on that day, I just kind of lost it. It hit me. I was crying in my girlfriend's dorm room about something, and I had this, it felt like an epiphany, where you just get this idea in your head that seems like divine or correct, and it's time to kill yourself. And I had been thinking about killing myself for a few months, but I had never created a plan, and it just hit me. So I freaked out. I remember going and looking in the bathroom mirror in my dorm and just looking at myself and being terribly afraid, because half of me didn't want to do it, but I felt like I was supposed to. So I just went back to my dorm room and took everything that I had, and I called my parents, mostly just because I wanted to hear their voices one last time. But fortunately, my mom, she's always good at she reads me like a book, and she just knew we gotta go. And so 2 hours later, they showed up and saved my life.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? Is there anything that connects in this as a child of a pastor?
That's hard to say. I think about it a lot, how my sister and I grew up with similar pressures, and yet we handled them very differently. She hasn't struggled with depression the way that I have at all. And so part of it is just personality, genetics, things like that. But part of it is just how I reacted to, kind of the spotlight of being a pastor's daughter, feeling that I needed to be something specific for the church. And it was not a pressure that my parents put on me directly. I can't ever remember them telling me anything, but we just want you to be you, be happy. They loved me how I was, but I just put it on myself. As the depression built, I began to almost get paranoid about what I was supposed to be and how I should act. And I saw it very much as wearing a mask and feeling that I was required to wear that mask and not allowed to be myself.
David, as you and Cindy look back, were there any symptoms, any signs that you saw that kind of gave you some clues as you have the hindsight to look back on it?
Well, yeah, hindsight's always 20/20. You can look back. And I think the summer before, we had taken a trip to Europe, right? The four of us. And we probably could have made a Chevy Chase movie about that trip, because it was, it had its ups and downs and ups. And, but even then, Laura Grace has told me that she was beginning to struggle some. But Laura Grace has always been very verbal, very talkative. She used to wear a T-shirt that says, "Help, I'm talking and I can't shut up." And so she's always been a talker. And then always calling, always emailing, and then for a couple of weeks before her suicide attempt, it just went silent. The email went silent. The telephone calls went silent. We're thinking, oh, well, maybe rush. She's in rush. Pressure of that, pressure of school. Maybe, something's going on. But, of course, now looking back, we see that when she just got quiet and stopped contacting us, that was when she was really deep into depression. We just didn't know it at the time, but looking back, that's a good sign, I think, for parents to look for. If there's sort of a change in the pattern of your child, don't be a little more perceptive than we were. We should have called a few weeks earlier and say, come on now, something's wrong. What is it?
So, Laura Grace, do you think you were just doing a really good job of hiding it? Was that on purpose that they didn't see that?
Yes, I was trying to hide it. I would say that there were a few people in my life who knew, but they would be friends. Some of them were very concerned. Some of them were just trying to be supportive. Some of them didn't understand. But from my parents specifically, I tried to hide it. I would say, everything's fine, this is going fine. I was afraid they would be disappointed that I wasn't going to class or that I wasn't enjoying sorority life or that I didn't like the college I'd chosen. I was just afraid of being a disappointment. And so I definitely tried to hide it from them. And when I went silent, that was more out of my loss of time and days and things like that. I lost my ability to hide it because I just shut down. So that was very intentional. I did not want them to know how I was feeling.
So as you look back, Laura Grace, you know the timeline, obviously, with two of you. Can you pick a point in time? How long was this going on, is my question, I guess. I've kept journals throughout my life, and I started a specific journal in the winter. I think it was January of 2000 when I was a senior in high school. And in that first entry, I see depression. So I think that I like to say it began at the beginning of 2000 when I have this journal. And so that was a year prior to the suicide attempt. Although the fact that depression shows up on page 1 probably means that it was happening a little bit before that as well. But I tend to say it started right at the beginning of 2000 for me. Wow. So David, you're at the hospital and the events have unfolded. You're obviously seeking, searching, trying to figure out. Describe for us, if you will, those days right at that point.
Well, of course, any parent in the room realizes how we felt. We just hurt, for our child. I mean, if any parent could switch and let, we could take their pain on us, we would. And here was Laura Grace in the hospital, had to go through a series of medical procedures to absorb what she had ingested, and that was very painful and uncomfortable for her. We went through several days of that. And in a way, that's still a blur, but our other daughter, Jenny, was in medical school at Galveston at that time. She drove up, and so, we kind of had the team there, the whole family, and we were there just to love Laura Grace and to support her, but it was a very, very painful time for all of us, and we just were hurting because she was hurting, and part of me was feeling guilty in that I hadn't seen that sooner. How can she go from being this wonderful, funny, gregarious, high-spirited girl to just someone who is struggling in the depths of depression? So, we always want to say, why didn't I pick that up, earlier?
I dare say that I would do the same. But does the word hopeless ever come into that discussion right at that time?
Well, to be honest, we never had a sense of hopelessness, never. Because we know the Lord, we know the power of the Lord, and we prayed hard, and we came together and just really poured our hearts out to God. And we always had a sense that, somehow, sometime, she's going to get better. She's going to come out of this, and may not be the same person she was before, but she's going to come out to a new normal. And so I've got to say, we never felt hopeless. And through the years, as she's had other episodes of depression, we've always maintained hope.
Excellent. So, Laura Grace, we got a bunch of college kids here in the room. Talk about college, and was there any trigger event, do you think, or any acceleration that happened because you were in college?
I had a really hard time choosing where to go to college. Because I was already depressed, I felt a lot of pressure about choosing college. And I really had this weird thing in my brain that said, if you choose the wrong college, your life is over. If you don't go to the right college and pick the right major and graduate in 4 years, then you've ruined your whole life. And I really believed that. And so I felt this huge pressure that at 18, I was deciding my future. And I know that that's not true because I left college and went home and then went to UT Tyler and got a great degree. And, plan B was better than plan A. But that was a huge part for me. And then I got to college and I'm expecting that I'm going to make it perfect because it's supposed to be. And it wasn't. I didn't like it. I wasn't making friends as easily. I was depressed. I didn't like the culture of Baylor for me personally. I didn't like what I was doing. I didn't like sorority life. I didn't like anything. And so I felt like life was over, that I had done the wrong thing and now I had no chance to repair it. And so I guess that the big thing is that college students need to know that this is not the end-all be-all of your life. This is just what you're doing for 4 to 6 years, and you can always stop and do something else. I mean, there's no rule that says you have to do it one way. And there's no rule that says it's going to be the best years of your life. It's just another part of life,
Yeah, and as you said, you put that pressure on yourself as you went through that. Was there anybody that ever gave you some advice to say, look, you don't have to be this, what's the word, passionate about this, where you're going to do all end all?
I think that my family was kind of like, stop freaking out about this. but I wasn't going to listen. I like to have my own way, think my own thoughts. And so I thought, well, they're telling me not to freak out, but they don't know. I thought I knew better than everybody else. And that's also the depression talking. The pressure, the depression, I like to personify depression a bit and say the depression wanted me to feel that pressure. It wanted me to freak out. Because that's how it had control.
So, David, we're at the point where you're having the thoughts. Probably, I've got a perfectly healthy, perfectly gregarious, out there young daughter who I've sent off to college, and now, in your words, she's ill. Talk about that feeling, that dichotomy of that feeling.
Well, yeah, I know that when we brought her back from Waco. She still was very troubled, very sick, and angry at herself and her what she had done. And I just remember how much we continued to hurt for her. And because of her attempt at suicide, we felt like we needed to pretty much watch her all the time. So there was several weeks there where Cindy and I, we would always make sure one of us was there, like watching her. And that was actually during a time in the life of our church when we were actually moving in the big worship center. It was the spring of 2001, and you were there, the big service, and everybody was excited. And it was the first service, and everybody saw me up there crying. They said, oh, he's so moved because he's in this big new building now. And they didn't know that the tears were because Laura Grace was at home struggling. Because at that time, it was a story that we had kept among ourselves, and we kept the story to ourselves until Laura Grace very bravely wrote her book to bring out into the open to help others what happened. So I just remember, I thought, we have a sick daughter, and I have never been one to think that there's any kind of stigma attached to mental illness. I think had she had pneumonia, we would have treated it. She had mental illness, depression, and we were going to do everything we could to treat it. And we weren't going to give up.
I think that's the big message here, isn't it? Don't quit. I'm sure that's biblical. Don't quit. Laura Grace, let's shift into another area of this whole thing, and let's talk about cutting. So can you give us a little sense, give the audience a little sense about what got you to that point and what kept that going?
It's kind of weird, but when I was a teenager, I watched this episode of 90210 where a character cut. It was a guest character, it wasn't even a main character. And I didn't even watch that show. But that image stuck with me, and it's like I filed it away in my brain. When I moved home after my suicide attempt, I was, like my dad said, still in a lot of pain. I was still suicidal. I still wanted to die. I was still struggling every day with just being alive. And it's like that image from that TV show came back in my head, and I thought, well, I'll try that. And I tried cutting with just a regular razor that I would use to shave my legs. And I immediately felt a release of pain. And I felt, because I hated myself so much, it felt really good to me to see myself hurt. There's so much internal pain that to see it externally is such a relief. And that feeling becomes addictive. You do it a few times, and then you're like, well, anytime you have this moment of crisis, you're like, I've got to cut so I can feel better. It's like doing a drug. And so I began doing that, but within, I would say, 2 weeks of starting, my sister found me out. And she saw one cut on my arm, and we were out to eat at a restaurant, and she took me back to the bathroom, and she said, show me right now. And she's my older sister, and so I was like, no, and she said, show me. And so I showed her, and she almost threw up. She became physically nauseous. And she just said to me, if you don't tell Mom and Dad today, I am. And we got home from that restaurant, and we sat down, and she forced me to tell them what was happening, and it was just something else on the plate of stuff we had to deal with. And at that time, I had to move from my own bedroom to staying with my mother because I would cut at night when I was alone. And that's when I was not allowed to really be alone, because I would use any opportunity I could to cut. And, we cook. It's not like we could get rid of everything sharp in the house. So I just was watched a lot. And, I never cut so terribly that I was at a danger. It wasn't another suicide attempt. I never tried to slit my wrists or anything like that, which often cutting is not about killing yourself. It's about this release of pain. But, my psychiatrist at the time just told me, she said, it's not about the cuts you're putting on your body. Those we can treat with, bandages. She said, but it's about what you're doing to your mind. The fact that you are giving in to self-harm is another unhealthy habit that just feeds the depression.
Did it ever get to a point in your mind where this is not enough? I've got to do something else?
With cutting, I was found out so early. I think in a lot of ways I felt therapy wasn't enough at times. Nothing was enough at times. But I am very much the kind of person who I just keep going, and I had family who wouldn't let me stop. My family made it very clear to me that suicide was not an option. This is not something that we think is right for you, and I knew very much my family did not want me to die. And so whenever things didn't feel like they were enough, we just kept going. I mean, there were days when I couldn't get out of bed, and I would lay in bed, and my mother would come wake me up, and I would just cry before I could even sit up because I couldn't get out of the bed. It was too much. And she would just sit there and help me get up. And she would go to the grocery store, and I would sit in the car because I couldn't go into the grocery store. Or we would go to the mall and walk with, the retired people at 8 a.m. because I needed to exercise. They didn't let me give up. And they sacrificed every single day to make sure that I kept moving forward, even in the tiniest increments.
All right, so we're at this stage, David. Let's go back to you. Your reaction, yours and Cindy's reaction on this. And it sounds like it was, we're here, arms and legs, to do whatever it's going to take. Tell us about that in your words.
Right. Well, it's just we offered her unconditional love. We told her that we love you whatever you do. If you try to kill yourself, we love you. If you cut yourself, we hurt too. We want to cut ourselves just to feel your pain, to empathize with you, but we're not going to give up. And I remember during that time, Cindy took the bulk of the time with Laura Grace, but I would always take Thursdays during that period of time. And so Laura Grace and I, we would hang out on Thursdays, and I remember we would just get in the car and drive, listen to music, go to Love's Lookout, and just sit there and talk for a while. So looking back on that, I enjoyed those times just hanging out with her, even though it was kind of mandatory for us to do that. But, over time, gradually, we saw her begin to improve, and so we could see some flashes of hope to know that, she may not ever completely overcome this, but she's getting better. And so that gave us a greater sense of hope to keep helping her.
So you see this help coming to you, Laura Grace. What's your reaction to it with mom and dad? Is it accepting, or is it? Tell us about that.
I think for a lot of depressed people, myself included, it's very hard to accept help because you don't feel like you deserve it. And I've felt this way throughout most of my episodes. I've had 5 depressive episodes in my life, and every single one, I don't feel like I deserve to get better. And so it's almost painful to receive unconditional love, to receive help, to receive support, because you're just like, they don't know how horrible I am. They don't know that I'm this terrible, terrible person who doesn't deserve this. Why can't they see what I see? But I laugh. I wrote this in a blog post very recently with my name being Laura Grace. It's almost like a joke that God played on me because I have the hardest time accepting grace, and yet people say it to me all the time, Laura Grace, Laura Grace. And so that's a big life lesson for me, is learning to accept grace, learning to accept that I don't deserve things, but that I get to have them anyway.
What a spiritual metaphor in this. David, why don't you expound on that a little bit? There's such a parallel here with God's grace to us.
Yeah, and the whole time the depression is telling her she doesn't deserve our help, she doesn't deserve our love. We know that's the lie of depression. And we know that she is worthy of our love and deserving of all the help we can give her. And the same is true with us. Sometimes we have a hard time accepting God's grace because we know, all of us, our lives are littered with mistakes, bad choices, times we have goofed up big time. And we sometimes think, how can God love me and forgive me and show me his mercy as bad as I've been? But again, that's the lie of the enemy. God is a loving Father. Remember that, a loving Father who cares for you just like I have cared for Laura Grace, except you multiply it about 10 zillion times, because he's a perfect Father, I'm not.
Well, guys, we're doing great on time. So before I get down to the last one, I do have a question for you, and we're going to get into kind of our last couple of questions, but I want you guys to take time because we've got time here. Laura Grace, tell us a little bit right now, if you would, about what helped you the most to help get back into school and get back into the work life and that transition.
I'm a big, big, big believer in behavioral therapy. That's a huge thing for me. I take medication. I've taken medication since I was 19. And I absolutely believe that a huge part of my depression is chemical, because when I take medication, I'm better. But I'm also a huge believer and proponent in both cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy. I participated in programs that do both of those. I believe in working every day. I meditate almost every single day and have for 7 years. I believe in mindfulness. I believe that you need to go to a counselor or a psychiatrist. You need to get outside help. You need somebody to talk to who's not part of your life. I'm just a big believer in therapy. That's huge for me, and I've been really blessed in my life to have some wonderful therapists, some wonderful opportunities to have great counselors, psychiatrists, and therapists. And I believe that therapy requires daily work. It's like exercise. If you want to, get healthier, you have to exercise a little bit every day. Well, I do mental exercise every single day. because, as one of my psychiatrists told me, when you think these negative thoughts, especially like suicidal ideation, you're creating these pathways in your brain. And the more you think them, the more traveled and worn those pathways become, the more easy it is to travel them. If you think a thought 100 times, it's way easier to think it the 101st time than the first time. Now, and that's chemical that happens in our brains. The only way to fix that is to create new pathways. So, constantly thinking positive thoughts, constantly thinking hopeful thoughts, and even though you don't believe them, forcing yourself to say, today's gonna be a good day. I love myself. I say it even when I don't believe it. I say it when there's tears streaming down my face, and I hate saying it, but I say it because one day I'm gonna say it and believe it. So I'm a huge believer in therapy, behavioral therapy. That's been key to my recovery. It's something that I've never left. And I also feel very blessed in that I feel motivated to do that work because it works for me. So many people have trouble being motivated to do therapy. They think it won't work. They think because it takes a long time to work that it doesn't work. Well, it just takes time. You don't lose 20 pounds in a week. You lose 20 pounds in a year. You know, I meditated for probably 2 years before I could get to this really mindful, good place. People tell me, meditating doesn't work for me. I'm like, do it 4 days a week for 3 years and then tell me if it works. And that's hard for people to do, but that's the only way I know how to do it. You just put in that 10, 20 minutes a day and try to get through it. And my parents were always very supportive of therapy. Like I said, we were very blessed to have wonderful psychiatrists and therapists. And they just really encouraged me. They would take me to my appointments. I always tell people, if you have a depressed person in your life who doesn't want to go to therapy, you need to pick them up. You need to drive them there. You need to sit in the waiting room while they're inside, and then you need to drive them home. And maybe you need to pay for it. Because everything in a depressed person's mind and body says, no, don't get better, don't get better. If you want somebody to get better, unfortunately, you got to put in a lot of effort. And my parents put in a ton of time and effort into making sure that I used the resources that were available to me.
I remember, David, you saying in church that, I don't know if it was you, but many children were drugged as a child. They were drugged to church, drugged to Sunday school, but that was a good thing. It's kind of like tell your face to be happy and the rest of you will follow behind. So we've got a couple more minutes here. Do you have any other just thoughts before we get down into your kind of closing thoughts?
Well, as we kind of tell the story on along, almost fast forward to today, I think it was really good for Laura Grace to finally get a job, start working, have a real reason to get up. And then once she was working and thought, hey, I can do this, then she was ready, I think, to go back to school. And I think you had a great experience at UT Tyler. Really enjoyed the classes there, worked in the writing center. She just didn't survive it. She really thrived in that environment. And then later went on to graduate school. So I think having those kind of goals has really helped her. And I know she was introduced this morning as a stay-at-home mom, but she's like a working mom now, single mom working.
3 weeks now.
3 weeks she's been working. And and like I say, I think people that struggle with depression, I think you never get to a point where you say, boom, I'm well. I think you learn to cope with it, deal with it, handle it on a level that is acceptable for you and your family. And so I would say to parents here, be perceptive and look for signs in your adolescence and just talk to them, make them sit down and be honest with you, because as Laura Grace said, she was wearing a mask and we didn't know she was wearing a mask. And looking back, we see now that she was, but we just weren't perceptive enough at the time. So I know you love your kids, but sit down with them and really try to find out what's going on inside.
Is it as simple as just sitting with your child and saying, how are you doing? And I'm not going to leave until I really find out how you're doing.
Yes, I think that's it. And we don't really, there hasn't been a lot of depression in our family. So perhaps there's some in a grandparent, but we weren't really looking for this because it was not something that any of us had struggled with before ourselves. So that was why it was harder for us to pick up on it to begin with.
Sure. All right, Laura Grace, we're going to kind of get a final wrap from you, and if you have anything else. But, what words of hope and advice would you give to the parents? And, we have some youngsters out here.
Keep working on it every day. Put in work. I sign all my books. There's always hope for healing. People don't always survive this. But if you believe there's hope to survive, maybe you will. I've had the kind of rule of thumb is the more times you go through a depressive episode, the less likely you are to actually ever escape depression. So I've had 5 depressive episodes since 2000. There's a very slim chance that I will fully escape depression in my lifetime. I'm probably going to always end up coming back to it. But at the same time, my last serious depressive episode was in 2013. I've had 4 years of relative health, meaning that I haven't been terribly suicidal for 4 years. That's the longest I've gone since my suicide attempt. There's always hope that things will get even a little bit better. I now have an 8-year-old daughter. She's a huge motivator for me to be well. I not only think about being around to watch her grow, but I think about possibly having passed down these bad genetics to her and thinking that I'm the best person who could be there for her. I try to find all of the reasons to fight, all the reasons to keep going. I write them down. I tell them to myself regularly. I just pound it into my head that I'm supposed to be here, that there is a reason for my struggle, and that I can make it. I've been to the very bottom, and here I am, pretty good today. So I think you just got to keep going. For the parents, if I could wish for every mentally ill person, parents like my parents, I would. Not all parents have the time and resources to do what my parents did for me, but if you have time, if you have resources, give them to your child, because depression is tough. Mental illness is tough. It does not want you to survive it. It wants to drag you down. It's why I personify it, because it feels like this thing inside of me that's trying to drag me down, that's trying to take over. But I have all these people around me who are trying to make sure that I don't drown. So if you're a parent, if you're a friend, if you're a sibling or whatever, stick with it. Be there. Do what you can to help this person, because there's a very good chance they cannot do it on their own.
Your dad said it again this morning, but he said it many times from the pulpit. And for those of you in the audience, if you did not write down this acronym, you should. HOPE is having only positive expectations. And I wonder if that's something that in the affirmation things that you go through, you have to almost go through that acronym in your head.
I absolutely believe in thinking positively. I have this little story. One day I took my daughter to school, and then I got in the car to drive home, and my car wouldn't start. So I was having to walk 2 miles home. And as I'm walking, I'm doing something many of us would do. I'm going, oh, I hate my life. I hate my life. I hate my life. And as I'm doing that in my head, all of a sudden it changed to, I love myself, I love myself, I love myself. And I was like, wait, what happened? And I realized it was because I tell myself all the time, I love myself, I love who I am. Loving yourself is the best thing you can do for yourself in this life. And it was just like, it was this epiphany to me that it was like, oh my gosh, it works. All that positive thinking kicked in when I needed it. And I realized that even though my car is not working, I love myself. I can walk 2 miles. This is no big deal. So I really believe in positive thinking, although, like I said, I think it takes years of practice before it really starts working.
Well, I think it really helped Laura Grace to write about her experience and feelings, because for about 10 years or so, it was sort of a family secret. And, a few of our close friends and prayer partners knew about that and prayed for us and prayed for Laura Grace. And so it's kind of like when she was writing these blogs, it turned into a book. It was like my wife and I said, do we really want this to be out there for everybody? And we decided, yes, we do, because it's such a great story to help so many people. I mean, the book, The Confessions of a Chronic Depressive, I've given it away dozens and dozens of times to people who say, this is where I am, or I have a child at this point. And for her, just writing through her feelings became very therapeutic for her. She continues to write. And that would be an advice to anyone who's struggling. Maybe write a blog, keep a journal, write it out. Expressing your feelings can really help you deal with a lot of the things that you're struggling with. So that was a big turning point, I think, for her mental health and for our family. It's like we could pull the curtain aside and say, okay, yeah, now we know what was going on,
Weight lifted off because of that. I know that I've had some smaller events in my life, and I've written them out. They've never gone anywhere, but I know the feeling that you feel from that, and I think, in my terminology, I think God will use these to take bad events and turn them into positive help for somebody else. Right? It's kind of what He does. Anything else before we wrap up here that just hits your mind that you'd like to say? You look lovely today, by the way. Thank you for that. You classed, as I said earlier, you're classing up the table here quite a bit between a couple of thorns here. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, David and Laura Grace. I appreciate your story, the story behind the story. And don't forget that she does have a book out there that you can get, and do read her blog. All right? Thank you all very much.